everyone. Welcome to At the Root of It. Today I have an old friend from high school. This is Mike. Mike, would you like to do a quick introduction to yourself, kind of frame our conversation for the audience as we're going to be talking about feedback today?
Sure. My name is Mike Lemma. In my professional life, I am a UI UX designer, but as you just said, we've known each other since high school, maybe even before that, right? Eighth grade, ninth grade,
Yeah,
somewhere around there.
technically.
Technically, yeah. So it's been a minute. Yeah, and there's a lot of feedback that is really in my line of work that also extends to outside of work, at least in the industry I'm in, and just the path that I'm on, feedback is a consistent thing. Constantly happens every day that I need to not chase, but look into or take to kind of better myself or better my work and things like that, which we'll obviously talk about.
So, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you're thinking about feedback? I mean, obviously, I guess most of it tends to happen in the workplace.
Yeah, my mind goes right to the workplace. For me, I'm trying to constantly create things to make people's lives better in UI and UX. So, getting from point A to Z, whether that's a product, an experience, a moment, means I'm curious, I'm entrepreneurial. I'm always looking for that meaning, not just in the moment. Um, so feedback is it's a part of my life in that part. As an artist, I'm always trying to get the feedback to better the designs, better the experience, better myself if there's something that I'm not seeing because I'm so into the weeds of what I'm doing. I need to sometimes take a step back as an artist, look at the canvas, see if I'm missing anything, or get it from someone else's perspective because I might be blind to what I'm doing because I'm so laser focused in. I'm not going to see stuff I might need feedback on, at least in a professional setting. When it comes to personal experiences, I think it kind of is along the same vein. Trying to get feedback in relationships or friendships, just communication, I think that kind of falls in that realm. There's a lot of different levels to how feedback can be taken in outside of a professional relationship. I see it as an evolving thing for me. But when I was younger, for example, I felt feedback could be like judgmental, right? Like if you mess something up, it meant it's something about you as a person. So I spent a lot of years on doing that, and learning like feedback doesn't mean you're broken. It just means that there's room to grow. And so that reframing took a lot of time.
How did you navigate that? Can you maybe expand on that a little bit?
A lot of therapy on one end. I've been doing that for like 10 years. I think a lot of it as well is based upon, the people that you're around, trying to not take it personal and just looking at it from their perspective and put yourself in their shoes as well. For me, I get very defensive when I get some feedback, not so much in the workplace. For whatever reason, my brain splits the two in half. But when it comes to personal stuff, it's a defensive mechanism that I put up. So that was something that I had to get over. And so look at it from the lens of the professional side. What actually my mind keeps drawing back to is like critiques in our class where we had to get critiqued on our work. It's not critiquing you, it's critiquing your work and how you can be better. So kind of taking that mindset and applying it in a personal nature, like, okay, you're not being critiqued individually. It's just something that you can work on to be better. Um, so I've had a lot of those conversations with, personal relationships or things like that. How can I do better? Like, for example, I forget things a lot. So I tell people that, outside of work, like I have severe ADHD, so my brain's all over the place. And maybe that's part of the creative side of it. Um, and I don't know if you've seen that video on social media with, I forgot the actor, Bryan Cranston. Like there's a scene from Malcolm in the Middle where he like tries to go out and get a item, but then he has to like, or fix a light bulb, but then he opens the drawer and the drawer's squeaky, and then he has to get WD-40 to fix the drawer, and then it's the whole thing, and then he takes out the engine, and the lady's like, "Oh, I thought you weren't going to the store to get a light bulb." He's like, "What do you think I'm doing?" So I'm in that same vein where I need to kind of hone in, get the feedback that's needed, and not scatter everywhere. So in terms of the forgetting aspect, I try to be very mindful of it. I do a really good job of making lists now using task apps and stuff like that, and just kind of refer back to them. And they've been very helpful.
You brought up something interesting, especially in in the context of being a student and in the classroom, getting feedback and,
Mhm.
you know, that's typically intended to be constructive feedback. Have you encountered situations where like a lot of feedback comes into how it's delivered, but also how it's received? We've talked a little bit about the receiving side, but how have you seen how feedback is delivered go wrong?
I think, it, again, I'm drawing back to college days. I've seen it go wrong where people are really passionate about giving that feedback, and I think the delivery is incorrect. And I think it comes off as a little bit abrasive sometimes, and the person receiving that feedback might not, take it correctly, or it just seems very like, okay, that could have been said differently. I think it's choices of words. I think now, obviously, I'm wearing a Harvard shirt, so I'm finishing my master's at Harvard. We're all grown up adults, professional. It's definitely different now, and feedback is being taken very constructively, and you're with all different ages of adults, and we're all trying to get to the same goal of learning and bettering ourselves and things like that. So, two very different sides of the spectrum. I think in college, when you're there at the beginning years, you're very immature, you're still out of high school, still discovering who you are, all those things. Some people are obviously better at communicating than others. I think the terms that are now trending of being empathetic and mindful of empathy and all that stuff wasn't really a thing back then. Um, and now I think people are leading with that or being very mindful of that. But mostly in terms of the wrong portion of what you asked, I think it's the delivery, the choices of words, or coming off a little bit abrasive, or something like that. I've definitely seen it in that lens, and I definitely have to see an adult step in and be like, all right, well, did you mean this or did you mean that, to kind of help ease the situation so it doesn't escalate. Not that people are going to be throwing fists or anything, but you know, artists are very, very protective of their work and their craft. So I can see it people getting offended by that. So you got to remove yourself and put yourself in the other person's shoes.
Mentioned something interesting around asking or somebody else comes in and asks the clarifying question, did you mean it like that? And that's something that took me a long time to learn. Also, in the context of therapy, is like asking clarifying questions. Like,
Yeah,
did I understand what you said correctly? Did you mean to say it that way? Just to understand, reiterate back what's being said to you to make sure that you've understood it the right way. I think that's a very underrated skill that I didn't know about, and I don't know how many people also know about it.
I think that's something that's still developing, even in the professional world, because even for me, at least in the creative space, sure, in my role, I have to ask clarifying questions, and I have to constantly do that, like question after question after question, just to get to the answer of what I'm trying to solve for. But I think some people might get overwhelmed by some of those clarifying questions and almost take offense to them and look at you like, oh, you don't know what you're doing, or kind of look at you from a different lens, which is kind of sad because, especially in my line of work, I'm trying to understand something. So I'm asking a lot of clarifying questions. And there are times where I have people kind of just being like, all right, you guys asking us questions, or you've asking us questions, do the work. It's like, okay, but I'm trying to get to the root of what we're trying to solve for. And I need to know these things now because you've opened a whole new line of questioning, of questions after answering these other ones. And some people just don't really, at least in the workplace, don't take it constructively. I worked at a lot of tech jobs, and tech is sometimes toxic. So I think some of the managers or leadership people you work with, it's a hit or miss. Sometimes they understand the process, they understand the questions that need to be asked. Others just don't seem to care, and just want to, be like, here you go. This is the problem that needs to be solved. Go for it, solve it. But at least in UI and UX world, you have to ask the questions, you have to do the research, you have to get to the root, no pun intended, of the problem in what we're trying to solve for.
Yeah, I think you were mentioning something earlier too around the words that are used, and
Yes.
that has definitely been something that's come up in feedback that I've gotten in the professional world, where I do work in tech, so I am surrounded by a lot of men, and sometimes there are specific words that are used that are not great words to use to describe women, and
Yes.
are charged words. One time I did get feedback that I was too aggressive. And that's definitely challenging to hear as a woman,
Yeah.
especially in the context of, I think in this particular situation, not remembering too much of the details, I don't think it necessarily would have come across the same way if I was a man and
Man.
had
Right.
said
Yeah.
done the same thing. But
Yeah.
there's just something about a woman asserting herself that comes across
Hmm.
aggressive.
Yeah. That's nothing new that I've seen in the tech industry as well, which is kind of dumb. And that actually makes me mad because people like you're doing the same thing as what the guy's doing. Why are you being like, I don't understand. Like, why are you being aggressive? I've seen many men and guys being aggressive or passive aggressive or making slide hand comments or whatever. I mean, I've heard a lot of horror stories, even from friends, where I don't know how much detail I want to go into this, but where like men are saying things behind closed doors and they're not getting reprimanded for it, but it's known that they're saying a lot of questionable things. And there's no action being taken. But like if a woman raises, concern over something that's very concerning, um, like stalking or whatever, not that I mean that's an extreme, but um, what you're now you're complaining or whatever. It reminds me of the Barbie movie, where the girl was like going down the list of things like, well,
Mm.
you're too fat or you're too this or you're too that, and there's all these labels that are attached, and she was right. Like why do guys get to have like the dominating part of the workspace? I've had some great managers that were female and colleagues that were female. I never saw them as abrasive or you know all the terms that you're throwing out. I mean, I just work with them. If there's ever a conflict, you discuss it and talk about it professionally. It's sad, unfortunately.
It is, and being a woman in leadership now, it was not necessarily something that I was intending to wear as a label, because I always have been able to approach being in my workplace as just being myself. I didn't necessarily feel like I had to hold the label of also being a woman. But I'm realizing more and more, especially after now like a year in my management position, that I whether or not I want that label, it's there, because there are areas and spaces where I am the only woman, and maybe I have to be more conscientious of things that are said, how we're collaborating as a team, because in some way the responsibility, whether it's mine to hold or not, falls on me. And
Mm,
that's definitely been challenging in the context of feedback, when I have to kind of find the right and delicate way to bring something up without it becoming I'm too sensitive or whatever other labels maybe I may get, which is, I agree with you, absolutely, like unnecessary in the
yeah.
workplace. But
I look at it like in that situation, if I were working with you, like I wouldn't label you or see you as like a woman or throw any labels on that. I'm just like, okay, it's a colleague that we're trying to get to a problem to solve, and that's where my mind's at. I don't put labels on things in my head. It's like, here's a problem that we're trying to solve. We're working on a team. We're doing X, Y, and Z. How do we do it? This person's really strong at A, B, and C. I might not have those skills, so I'm going to go to them and lean in them as much as possible, whether regardless if they're a guy or a girl. I just want to get the problem solved at the end of the day. I don't care about, well, I mean, I do care about the labels, but it doesn't, I don't think about it in those terms like, oh, it's a woman, so they're very sensitive, whatever. I've never had those types of experiences personally, but I've seen them around me. I will say, though, I did have one person report to me where they were female, but I didn't put any labels on them. I think it was more of a, I want to say it was either cultural or behavioral, not in the sense that they're sensitive in that aspect, but, and I'm probably gonna uh, go against what I just said here, but it was a Gen Z person that I was managing, and I think they had a lot of ambition at the time, but they didn't understand structure in teams and just professionalism and stuff like that. They would do a lot of really questionable things that I think just was common sense in the workplace that they just, I'm sure you just heard hundreds of stories, over the years about younger generations just doing things you're just like head scratching because, we've entered the workforce in a way where we've kind of followed what the previous generation has done, but maybe made some changes. But things like going over my head and talking to the CEO, and that's probably not at startups, and that's probably not something you should do, or thinking you're better than somebody else on the other team. So I would have to set up a lot of different team bonding experiences. That's the best way to describe it. Exercises for everybody to kind of play off each other and work together to solve a problem. Um, Unfortunately, that was targeting that specific person because we wanted their behavior to improve so they wouldn't kind of get into this funk of thinking that they were better than everybody else. Definitely a high ego working with, and we found out that that person had like nine siblings, so they were the youngest. So I think it was more of a I need attention type thing, and that's fine. You're more than happy to be ambitious as you want. And my strategy was to place them on their own project and give them ownership of that project, so they can still feed that ambition, but also have structure with other members on the team and other members in the org to kind of help them go down a path of growth and things like that. So that was an interesting experience that kind of threw me for a loop. I've never really experienced that before. It was so bizarre. Um, but then as time went on, and I heard similar stories in the news and on social media, it's now really not that uncommon anymore. But yeah.
It's interesting because you utilized a really good technique in order to get this individual into a better place. And it's like just team bonding because so much of being able to not only even give but receive feedbacks comes down to trust. And the
Hmm.
trust is built when there's psychological safety. And to
Hmm.
do that, you need the team to get to know each other as individuals outside of the workplace and not just as people in the workplace and like that rigid boundary that may exist
Yep.
there. I
Yep.
think there's a common, maybe it's still rooted in older generations, and it's definitely, I think, hopefully dying off with millennials. I hope that the workplace has to have these rigid boundaries between work and life. The
Hmm.
reality is like we're not like we turn into a different person when we go to work. It's not like we live on the severed floor and we turn into a different personality as soon as we go to work. We bring everything of who we are into work. So the more somebody knows about you as a person, the better they can adjust maybe how they communicate with you for a manager, how they manage
Exactly.
you. And so it's having that information is an asset, it's not a liability. But I still
Correct.
haven't really seen that concept gel too much. I think it's
Yes.
starting
Agreed.
to get out there, but
Yeah.
I think Gen Z
Yes.
will certainly push the needle
They're definitely going
more.
to push that mold. Yes, exactly. Because I've always heard like, oh, you shouldn't mix business with pleasure and all that stuff, right? I've heard like, oh, you shouldn't, if you get somebody or get to know somebody too much, that's a big no-no or whatever. And then you look at them from a different lens, and then if you become friends, I've heard so many different spectrums of this. Like, oh, if you're friends at the work, be careful who you tell things to. They could backstab you. Da 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 da. I haven't really seen that per se. Maybe like once or twice, and it's like, oh, okay, well that's interesting that they said X, Y, and Z. But I think from a manager's perspective, understanding someone's situation and things like that, I think that definitely could help in terms of giving feedback and constructive feedback and whatnot. And nowadays, we're all working remotely. I know there's a hybrid model, so we are bleeding our personal lives into our work lives. So I think it's going to come kind of full circle at some point and together and just mesh together. I think the companies that succeed are the ones that are tight knit and be like, "How was your weekend?" "Oh, I went here and I did this, and I did all these things." And then people are invested in knowing that and sharing common interests and stuff like that. I think as we get older, it was easier to make friends in high school, but now as an adult, it's kind of harder to make friends. And the friends that you did have in high school, we've all gone our separate ways, obviously, had families, whatever. Um, and so finding that connection again and whatnot is probably in the workplace. So, uh, that's where you're going to be finding people to kind of hang out and find common interests and whatnot. But being remote, it makes it difficult unless you're hybrid and everything. But again, everybody has different lives. So uh, it's interesting. As you get older, you look at things from a different lens.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I think in the context of building those kinds of friendships in the workplace, I know that it's certainly easier to hear feedback if you have built that relationship with that person, because maybe you may not deliver it perfectly despite your best intentions, but because they understand you as a person, they know
Yes.
maybe 10-15% you weren't able to get in terms of like perfecting your messaging.
Yes. Yes. And I had that exact experience. Again, same job, different employee that reported to me. That one came from the college that I went to. So there was a connection there. And then I just really understood that person and, became somewhat friends with them even outside of work, but still maintained a short arm's length away, be like, all right, I'm still your manager, but at the same time, we can hang out, it's cool, whatever. But when it came to the feedback delivery, they took it really easily. It's like, hey, like straight up, like, hey, you need to change this, or this isn't working. Can you fix this? Can you fix that? Or hey, this needs to be improved. And they took it no problem. There was no issues there between a friendship, but also the reporting structure. And delivering that feedback was just so much easier than just sitting down with somebody, having that awkward conversation, sitting at a table, going down a list of things to kind of give that feedback to that employee and whatever. So I've been on both sides of the spectrum of that, and I prefer the other side as opposed to the awkward conversations and the awkward silences. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think for me, I've gotten a lot better about delivering feedback, but I used to get very wrapped up in what the other person may think of either the feedback or me as a result of
Mm,
hearing that feedback, because I was a
hmm.
kind of immersed in other people's emotions. So that took a little bit to unwind and get to a place where I could kind of separate that I am here to deliver specific feedback with these intentions, and I am not responsible for how somebody else feels as long as I delivered it in a fair and like polite manner.
Right. And I think too, people don't realize this feedback is not only given in a verbal tone, right? Feedback is shown up in a form of body language, a form of silence, even a sigh. That's negative, but right. So sometimes the most impactful feedback isn't spoken, right? It's felt as well. I've definitely had those experiences where I've had silence, and silence says a lot. I don't like it. It doesn't help me, but it is a form of feedback that is being given. It's almost like, and not relating to this situation, but like a parent-child, you know, relationship. Like, okay, you're gonna ignore your kid for a little bit. You're saying like, you know, calm down, whatever the situation is. Right? You're being silent, and that is a form of feedback until um, the situation is corrected or they calm down or whatever. It's almost the same in that regard.
Yeah, and you mentioned something interesting too. I think so much of how we think about feedback is also modeled for us at a really young age. Like I know that I would never necessarily see, for instance, my dad take feedback very well. He'd be incredibly defensive and it got to the point where you kind of didn't want to be around him if he had recently heard something bad, because the immediate instinct is to be defensive and to assume the other person is wrong.
Right.
And I think he just genuinely lacked a lot of like emotional intelligence to understand his part in things. But I'm
Yep.
curious, how was feedback modeled for you growing up? We talked a little bit about it at the beginning, but kind of want to dive into
I
it a
would say
bit
my
more.
dad's the same as yours from a dad perspective. Not that emotionally intelligent. I look at it in a different lens from now. I think he has his own, um, I don't call them demons or anything like that. That's not what it is. His own way of taking feedback. There is the defensive part of it. I think genetically I get that from him. More feedback from my mom. She comes at it from a place of rooted in care. She wants me to succeed, right? So that feedback was very helpful because it was something that I can kind of use as a launching platform to reach a goal or things like that. Whereas the opposite side of the spectrum, what shut me down is feedback that's delivered from a place of superiority or certainty. And I know that that energy is not a good energy. And so I'm coming, I want to come from a place of curiosity and build upon that and, head towards the path of succeeding. So two different parents styling, uh, they're still together, but I would go to her more for feedback. Sometimes it would come together and give me feedback, and I think that was more neutral, which was actually an interesting way to look at it now that I look back on it. But from an individual perspective, they had different approaches. So,
Yeah, I would say probably what I learned the most from my dad was more feedback in an academic and like achievement focus
mm,
perspective. So the feedback was essentially driving me towards perfectionism
mhm.
as a child, because that was what success looked like, was to
Yeah,
get the straight A's, is to
yeah,
do well in school, get
yeah.
into the right college, get the right degree. So it was almost it was like an expectation baked into his feedback, and even if it was a reasonably good grade, it wasn't good enough if it wasn't at his bar. I think a lot of that then internalized. So I do have perfectionism tendencies, and I think for a long time, probably not now as an adult, but I did definitely have a lot of negative self-talk that I would almost tell myself as feedback,
Mm,
about the things I was doing, or like, oh, did I dress nicely today? Or was I, maybe I should do this or that at school. And it was a lot of pressure to hold as a child.
yeah. It's funny you say that because looking back at it and not singling you out, but I think a lot of kids we went to school, at least in our school, were along that same vein of feeling the way you felt. I think it was also because of the cultural aspect of how many of those kids went to our school. Right, there was a lot of Indian population, Asian population. Their parents wanted them to succeed, so there's a lot of pressure on them. And I definitely saw that in school. So luckily, my parents weren't like that. I mean, I think they wanted me to succeed. And yes, my dad is a perfectionist, and he still is. Even when he finishes something, he says perfect. So, he's a perfectionist. So I think a lot of that actually still stems in me to want to be somewhat perfect and be like, hey, look at this thing I did, like this amazing thing. Like when I got into Harvard, I was like so excited to tell him, and me and my sister like set up this um situation where I wore a Harvard shirt and we were trying to get him to be like, why are you wearing a Harvard shirt? And so when I told him I got in like 2.5 years ago, he was like jaw hitting the floor, like, no, you didn't get in. I was like, yes, I got in. And now I'm going to graduate next month with a 3.9 GPA or something, which is almost straight A's. I got one A minus. So that's perfection to me. I wanted to get that 4.0, but that's okay. I'm still I'm still happy. I made the dean's list, so and they're proud and whatnot. and they're going to go to my graduation in May. So yeah. And you said something else too about internalizing it as well. I think it's also something you kind of do self-reflecting on, and you're kind of giving yourself that feedback where you shouldn't listen to that voice if it's in a negative part, right?
Yeah.
Um, that voice that kind of creeps in the back of your head and gives you a little bit of doubt. I've definitely heard that voice from time to time. I know people who have heard that voice a lot, and I try to tell them don't listen to that voice. Depression can kind of stem from that as well, but you got to just not listen to that voice. So,
Yeah, and I think, I've been doing, in the context of so many of the things I've done in the last 3 quarters of school, a lot of it has been these constant like leadership surveys. A
mm,
couple of the questions that always typically come up is, I'm hard on myself when I don't do things correctly. And it's like a scale, a strongly agree and strongly disagree. And probably a while ago, I probably would have put strongly agree. Yeah, I am pretty hard on myself when I don't do things right. But now I would say I've gotten to a better place where I can acknowledge that, yeah, that could have gone better, but I don't sit in the feeling for too long. I
mm,
like move through it and I'm like, well, tomorrow's a new day. I can try again. Like it's not,
right,
the world isn't over. And I
right.
think, like, I think a lot of taking feedback now, especially in the last couple years after all the work I've done in therapy, has mostly been because I have kind of stabilized my like emotional state. And I think it's from, I have anxiety, I have PTSD, and so there's a lot of ruminating. There's a lot of other things that my head's constantly stuck in, and
Hmm.
through trying to work through with my therapist, I'm able to at least balance out a little bit more day to day, so I'm not in this constant state of hypervigilance. And
Hmm.
it does make me able to receive things a little bit better. I still have some tools and techniques that I got to be able to receive feedback better, but some of it just is tied to, am I just having a good day? And is this the right
Mm,
time for me to be hearing this? And oftentimes now I'll try to start conversations. If it's going to be something difficult, I'll try to caveat it. Like just the other day, I had to ask a very tough question to someone, and I was like, "Is it okay if I ask you a sensitive question?"
mm,
Because I knew
yeah,
it was going to be a bit challenging. And
sure.
thankfully this person, like, I could tell was guarding themselves but said yes, and then we had a conversation about it. But it makes me so much more aware of, I mean, it's a simple question, but I don't know how many people necessarily ask it. It doesn't even matter if it's in the workplace or not. Is, is this the right time? Like, can I give you some feedback that might be hard to hear?
And at least for me, like when I hear those words, if I'm going to get feedback along that realm, I've gotten pretty good at removing myself from being defensive in that aspect, at least in the professional setting. I'm still working on it in the personal setting, but I don't want to say I'm numb to it. I think a lot of it is due to I don't want to call it training, but all the critiques I've had of all my work throughout my career to a point where it's not a reflection of me. It's just a reflection of, okay, I'm trying to build a good experience or a good product or whatever. What I'm doing is not working. So what's a better solution that I can utilize in that? And something you said earlier, I just wanted to call out, not to go off on a tangent, but you were saying earlier about how your parents wanted you to get straight A's and things like that. I think a lot of that too, from the self inner feedback loop. I think a lot of that is just feedback we've internalized from somebody else long ago, and then now it's masquerading as our own voice inside our own head.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does, because I think coming out of what happened to me in childhood, I've had to come to the realization that there's a lot of beliefs, a lot of coping strategies, things that were necessary at that time that are still with me because I didn't know I needed to let go of it. I didn't know it was no longer necessary to think that way or act that way. And I've had to let go of a lot of that in the last couple years because it doesn't
Mm.
serve me anymore. And it was at a very specific point in time where I needed those strategies to survive. And I don't need to be like that anymore. One of them was just generally being distrustful of people because of the way I had grown up and because I've having seen so many like broken friendships, broken relationships, my own parents' relationship. I didn't trust people, and eventually I learned to I can learn to trust people again. And it was less about not trusting people as a binary. It was more about being discerning about who I can trust. Once I get
Right.
enough information that maybe you're not the right person to trust, adjust myself appropriately.
It's interesting. Looking back at it, and again, this kind of reflects on what you said earlier. You don't really know somebody until you actually have that conversation. So, sitting at lunches with you or talking with you in the hall, I would have never pegged that as, having trust things because you always came off as friendly and whatnot. So, and for me, like I personally, I don't think I have trust issues for some people, unless like they give me a reason to not trust them. I think me, it's just I go in on a clean slate, and then if something happens or whatever, then okay, I question something or whatever. But um, I'm pretty even, level-headed, mild, mild tempered or whatnot. It takes a lot to really rile me up or whatnot and get me upset. Because even my mom tells me 1,000 times, hundreds and hundreds of times, like, oh, you're so level-headed, you don't get upset like your dad or whatever, you don't have his temper. But sometimes I do, if I really like, if something really, really, really bothers me. But it really takes a lot to get me there. And that could be in a form of feedback, that could be in form of an argument or whatever. But it takes a lot to kind of push that button to kind of get me to that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because at least back then, and I would tell a lot of people this, who knew maybe about what was going on. Going to school, being there, trying to succeed in academics, trying to have friends, that kind of felt like the real me. That kind of
Mm,
felt like I could be that person and that was real. When I went home is when I became somebody else because that was toxic and I needed to find a way to heavily compartmentalize my life in order to be able to survive.
right.
Uh, so I think at least back then, the persona that I presented at school, I was trying to be myself because I had to be so protective and on guard at home. But I think what I realized in the end is it's really hard to be two people at
Sure.
once.
Yeah.
And so the best thing for me was not having to live two lives anymore. So that's why my goal for the longest time was to leave home
Right.
because then it means I didn't have to hold on to being two people at once, which is why
Right.
maybe I feel so strongly about the workplace because
Mm,
I think if you're not trying to be just one person, you're kind of almost filtering and sanitizing parts of yourself in order to be at work when
sure.
it might not be the best thing for you and your growth if you can't be one person in both places.
It sounds like it's your safe space, almost in a way, your workplace. You sound very
Yeah.
passionate about it.
Yeah, I really, there's a reason I'm hitting 11 years in
There you
this
go.
month. Is I have been able to find that community, and you talk about making friends at work, and I moved across the country for
Yep.
this job, and many of my colleagues are my friends because I needed community when I got here. I didn't know anybody.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you're in a new area, a new place, ironically, in the area that I grew up in when I was little. I miss
Yeah,
California.
yeah.
And I think the yeah, honestly, I think the environment is also a factor in that. Like East Coast versus West Coast are very
Oh
different
yes,
things.
yes.
The two things I don't think people realize between the two, East Coast, you're more indoors. You really can't get out as much unless you hop in a car and go somewhere. In California, you can hop on a bike and go out your door and go biking down the road. They're very bike friendly, outdoor friendly. And I even heard about this when I was younger. I realized when my parents bought a house there, my room is so small compared to um, the East Coast, and I was like, why is my room so small? And the whole theory behind that was the rooms are small, but it's because most people spend their time outdoors, not indoors. Whereas on the East Coast, you're indoors because you have snow, rain, cold weather. You maybe get 3 or 4 months of good weather, but California, it's a lot different. And being outside is probably therapeutic, right? There's so much to do out there. There's so many great things. Not saying there's not stuff to do out here as well, but I think it's more easily accessible than it would be on the East Coast, at
Oh
least in
yeah. Yeah, and
California.
there's a seasonality around it. And I mean, if we're going to talk East Coast, West Coast, I think probably one of the things that I realized within probably the first couple of months of moving here was I needed to adjust my communication style drastically.
Mm,
I mean, I don't necessarily think it's just a Silicon Valley thing. I think it's just a West Coast thing where people are just not as direct.
right.
And coming from Jersey,
You're very
I
yeah,
needed
I know
to
that.
I needed to find a way to kind of curb it because it was rubbing people the wrong way. Whether it was the cursing or I mean all the things that were just very quintessential
Sure,
Jersey.
Jersey. Yeah.
Uh, and having to like mellow out and then realizing now as I'm a leader and a manager that a lot of I think some of my assets as a leader are because of my East Coast tendencies. I am more direct. I am
Mm,
more of the challenger in these spaces. And I think I'm learning to embrace that, even if it does sometimes isolate me even further in the
mm.
workplace.
It's funny you say that because I think I had the opposite where I grew up on the West Coast and I have a lot of that mellowness, and then I adapted to that Jersey style. So I have this weird hybrid where I'm mellow, but I can be rigid if I need to be. But being here longer now that I've been here, probably the rigidness is uh, outweighing the mellowness. So
Yeah, I mean it makes navigating even giving feedback very very different. I because I am more direct. I've had to learn to soften some of that so that the feedback doesn't come across as abrasive. But at the same time, even outside of East Coast, West Coast, I actually think you touched it a little bit on it earlier, but even cultural differences are a huge factor as well.
very.
I've noticed that a lot of Asian cultures do tend to be a little bit more direct,
Hmm.
and so it kind of means this is where knowing people in the workplace, understanding their cultural background really gives you context into how to deliver messaging, how to communicate with them effectively so that ultimately we can all just work in a collaborative way instead of finding like
Sure.
these abrasive ways to rub against each other.
Sure. And it's funny you mentioned that because on that note, I've kind of gotten used to certain cultural things where I'm trying not to stereotype certain behaviors at work, but we work with a lot of different um, offshore teams for certain things. And throughout my career, I've seen pretty much the same themes over and over again. I won't go into details about it, but as an example, a lot of hand holding or not being consistent in certain things. And after a while, again, not that I'm trying to stereotype certain offshore teams, but I take it with a grain of salt because I'm fully expecting to kind of have that type of experience again. Now it's more 50-50. Sometimes I'll get somebody really good at what they're doing, and sometimes I get kind of the lot of what I've been used to for 13 years. But the approach is a little bit different now from giving that feedback to them when I need to. And I try what I can to be as constructive as I can and giving as much detail as I can. Where in the past, I think it's like, change this, do this. And then you kind of go back and forth for an entire day, and an entire day is wasted. Now it's more of like, here's a very detailed document of what I need, and please change it to the specifications of how I wrote it out. Um, so that's, I think, definitely changed over the years for me. I still take it with a grain of salt when I work with offshore teams. It's just there's been a lot of PTSD there for me working with them because I've seen a lot of bad whatever engineers or developers or designers that just need a lot of hand holding or don't know what they're doing. And I don't know if that's just a cause of just you have a better education or they're just kind of chasing a paycheck and they're just taking orders, marching orders and not really thinking critically. And so for me in those roles, I need people to think critically about some of the decisions that are being made or some of the changes that are being made so I don't have to do that for them because then I'm kind of overloading myself thinking on what I need to do, but also thinking for somebody else. And then I'm almost doing two jobs at once, which is what I don't want to do.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's I've had to understand too about working with people from different cultures is like there is a sense that many people in the world, probably especially in some of these countries that are kind of helping offsource some of the work,
Right.
where there's a sense of survival. Like they're just in a survival
Hmm.
state all the time.
All the
And
time.
yeah,
Yep.
they very much could be living paycheck to paycheck. And I think you mentioned something really important earlier about feedback, and it's detail. I think how often I've gotten feedback in our performance cycle, we do peer evaluations. How often I get feedback that, this or that, but then there's no context, there's no detail for me to understand more about what
Yeah.
this person said. And it's
Right.
anonymous. So unless I kind of have a very clear conversation with my manager who can see who said it, who might be able to kind of tell me some bigger context around it so that I can understand what I really need to improve on. And I think one thing I've tried to do in adding detail into feedback that I give is try to provide the why. Like
Mm.
this is feedback for maybe this particular action, but it's not just about the feedback and the situation. It's about why does this feedback even matter? How is this going to improve you or improve our collaboration? So why should you care? Because I'm constantly reminded of a concept that we learned in when we did our PMP for project management um, is WIFM. What's in it for me? So it's like if you
Right.
hear feedback, if you don't maybe have a growth mindset, which sometimes people may not have developed a full growth mindset, what what's in the feedback for them? Like why should I care about this feedback? So I've tried to layer that in a little bit to provide more context, more detail on arriving as to why this feedback is important and why you should care about it.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it's funny that you say that too, because I've been in those situations where I have to give that feedback, and it's almost like there's this awkwardness because as you just said, it's like you want to know the why, but then you need to have that harder conversation as to the why, and then you kind of go down this rabbit hole of like, okay, well, I don't want to offend this person or whatever. And if you're trying to give them that constructive feedback, how do you do it in a way that you're not gonna annoy them or piss them off? Because then there's this whole other element, at least in the workplace. It's like, well, if I said something bad, then they're going to give me a bad review and look at me in the wrong light and wrong retaliation, whatever. I mean, it's happened, right? And so it is difficult for people to kind of have those conversations because it kind of opens that awkwardness between the two. At my last job, we had to actually give feedback to get bonuses and all those things on like a form internal to the company. And it wasn't really the greatest experience because people are just writing them to write them because you have to do them in order to kind of not
Oh.
move up in the company, but just to kind of like meet you have to meet a number or meet um, a goal for that quarter. Like everybody had to do them. It was a mandatory thing. And it's almost like this feedback that's just not genuine. It's just like they're writing something to write it because they have to get it done.
Mm.
And, they have to hit that metric for, the quarter. Um, every now and then there was something that was in there that was good, but then they layered it in with all this other stuff where we had they call them counselors, and those people kind of review the feedback with you, and they're kind of like this third party person that doesn't impact your career. They're just kind of they're helping to coach you. Sometimes it's helpful depending on the person you have, sometimes it's not. I've had a couple counselors. I had one who just kind of said, "You're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great." But that's all I heard. I never heard anything else. All I heard was, "You're doing great." There was no constructive feedback behind that because they would have meetings with the people and be like, "All right, what's he doing good in and whatnot." And that was really frustrating for me because I didn't know what great meant, even though as you said earlier, like I'm clarifying, I'm asking follow-ups and clarifying questions. And they're like, "No, you're just doing great. Everything's good. Keep what you're doing." And I was like, I can't keep doing this. It's ridiculous because I need something uh, tangible to kind of go off of. So I had to switch to somebody else, and then that person was able to give me like actual clarifying feedback and set up like structured things for me to hit goals to kind of rely on because you're doing great is not helpful at all whatsoever.
Yeah, you know, we've talked a little bit, I mean, mostly about constructive and not necessarily negative feedback, but not necessarily like positive feedback. But there is something to be said about having very detailed positive feedback. I'm
Hmm.
incredibly grateful for occasionally when I get peer evaluations and they're not just keep doing what you're doing. I was like, okay, thank you.
Right, right.
It's oh, I really appreciated how you organized this, or you run your meetings very tightly. If it's
Hmm.
something more detail, I'm like, okay, that's resonating, I can do more of that. I
Yes.
got feedback very early on in my career, that I am really organized and logical, and it eventually, I got enough of that very specific feedback that I was like, oh, like interesting. And then I eventually moved into project management
Hmm.
because of that feedback. So I'm very appreciative when people are able to provide more detail than just a generic keep doing what you're doing or you're doing a great job. It's, at a certain point, especially if you're have a growth mindset, want to improve in your career, it can't just be that you're looking for the constructive feedback, because at some point you do obviously start leveling up and you are doing better, that you need to also know what you're doing really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny you say that again, because I had a manager who actually asked for feedback at one of my old jobs. And what I try to do when I'm giving the positive stuff, I just call out the things that I like about that person or what they're doing just immediately. And then I'll kind of drill into the detail, whether that's something they need work on or just something positive. I've had really good managers in pretty much my entire career. I would say maybe had two or three that were so, and they were just there to like clean house or whatever. But most of the managers I've had in my career, I have personal relationships with now, and I still have their phone numbers, and we text. And this is 10 years later. Um, but with that particular manager, I would say like, hey, I love that we go on our walks because we were in a small town, so we were able to walk around. It was in Lambertville, so we were able to walk around in Lambertville and just do goal discussions and just feedback for them, feedback for me. Um, and I really enjoyed those because they were a safe space in a way. And we would go out, we get ice cream. It wasn't just you're trapped in a room or whatever. So I gave him feedback like, love doing that. You're a great manager. I love, having our conversations. I love all these things. I would love to see more of this and not so much you're doing bad at this, but I would say would love to see more of this, or I need more time with you on this element or that element. I know you're busy, would love to kind of have you focus on this for me so I can accomplish these goals. So I kind of gave it constructively in that aspect and not like, you were really bad at this and I didn't like that or whatever. And that's really the approach I've always taken when I've given positive feedback. I always say like, I love this, I love this. Sometimes I overthink it. I'm like, oh, am I giving too much positive stuff? Like, I need to focus on some of the things that are constructive, or am I balancing it well? And that's something I still am figuring out. Is the delivery. Am I kind of sugarcoating it too much, or is there something in there that is actually they're going to take to heart and utilize and whatnot. And I've seen improvements with some people that I've given feedback to. Others kind of just take it and whatever. That's more on them than me. uh, but that's usually how I give feedback to people. I try to frame it in a way like, I love this about you. I love this what we're doing. This has really worked for me. I could really use more of X, Y, and Z. Um, And I think it's the language that I'm using that's helping.
Yeah, and I mean, even adjusting it to whoever you may be talking to. But one thing you mentioned there is really important is as the person who's kind of, in that situation, a direct report to a manager, you're kind of giving feedback up and you're providing this is what I need more of, which is in its own way a different type of feedback, which is really
Right.
powerful too. It's like
Right.
as the person who's being managed, you can also ask for what you need. And that is a form of feedback.
Yeah. Yeah, because that particular person had like 9 people reporting to them, and it was a
Yeah.
startup structure. So it was a lot of people rolling up to them, and they were going in 9 different directions all the time, and everybody going to them, and they couldn't really accomplish what they needed to do. So then they kind of condensed it to 3 people rolling up to them, and then we would give feedback to, I guess it was a reorg in a way, giving that feedback to next level up, and then they give it to her. But she still had conversations with us, but we talk more high level than more granular day to day things, just so she can kind of get a bird's eye view of her whole team of what she needs to tackle and what she needs to fix. She gravitated more towards the product owners than everybody else. I think that was a positive and a negative, only because I think she formed that bond and closeness with them. So the way I described it was almost like a devil and angel sitting on her shoulder, telling her things that I don't think was good. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. You got one person saying one thing, one person saying another thing, telling her things, and then things get restructured or fixed. But then other people's feedback wasn't really getting incorporated. And I think that's kind of where the ball kind of got dropped in that restructuring or reorg or whatever. I wasn't really a fan of that structure, because then she kind of shunned out other people. We still got feedback to her, but after a while, I think it became a party of 3 instead of a team dynamic, which unfortunately wasn't great in the long run. But I understand why it was needed, just because there was just so much happening at the time, going through an acquisition, and just the product. They were the product owners, so they had more insight into what needs to be done. She was the head of product. Design was more, I don't call it an afterthought, but I think it kind of fell under both of those teams, and what can design deliver to the product owners. So
Makes sense.
yeah.
Well, at the top of the hour here, I'll ask the question and feel free to bounce it back to me afterwards. But from feedback in the professional world to feedback also closer to home, um, what do you think is at the root of feedback?
There are many different ways to say this. For me personally, I think it's at the root of feedback is probably to be seen and hope that we matter. I
I
think
love
those are
that.
the 2 things to take away from that.
I love that. Um, I think one thing that, and again, this also might be more so just for me, but I think for me, at the root of feedback is vulnerability. And I
Mm.
think that that's the reason for me because I've had to be so protective over myself for such a long time that really in order to even be in a space to give it well but also receive it is I have to be vulnerable and not get wrapped up in how I feel as a result of what I'm saying or hearing.
I think that's for everybody as well, even for me. And I think you put it really well. I think everybody can relate to that, because I think we all are afraid to be vulnerable when we give feedback, whether that's in the professional space, personal space, friendships, relationships, whatever. There's that vulnerability, because then that's attached to fear. And then that fear brings uncertainty and unknown, right?
Yeah, and in the face of the unknown, all I want to do is clamp down control because that's how I'm
Right,
used to dealing with
right,
uncertainty.
right. Me too. So exactly what you mean.
Well, I appreciate your time today, Mike. It was really nice talking to you and catching up too and hearing
Yeah,
more about what you've been going through. So
yep,
thank you for your time.
no problem.
And for audience listening, if you would like Mike to come back and further chat about any other topics, feel free to put that in the comments. But thank you, Mike.
No problem.